Welcome to Terabytes. A big shout out to Terabytes' new thumbnail editor for the headline grabbing, attention seeking, and wildly inaccurate subtitle. Thanks, guys. A round of applause. But if you were coming to this site to find out whether or not aliens colonised the planet, spoiler alert, no, they didn't. The actual title of this episode is Drove, and it's probably going to be in more than one part, so I don't know how many as yet. But the first subject that we're going to look at is how the Drove roads were actually made. But people have been researching the Drove roads in Britain for many years now, and here are some of the books that I've used, some of the better books. The Drovers Roads of Wales by Faye Godwin and Shirley Toulson, and also The Drove Roads of Scotland by A.R.B. Haldane. And these are the maps. On the left you can see Haldane's maps of Scotland, and also on the right we can see Professor T.R. Jenkins' map of the Drove Roads of Wales. And here's a modern representation of these maps. Google Earth doesn't really do these justice since from this height, since the actual roads are to within a metre accuracy. By the way, I forgot to mention in the last slide that Professor Haldane's book, The Drove Roads of Scotland, is available as a free download from the University of Edinburgh, so I'll put a link in the description below. The history of cattle droving is the history of these islands, from the very start of records, 1000 to 1200 CE, and cattle droving is mentioned frequently even in the higher legislatives of kings and lords. But I believe these drove roads are far, far older. There is something deeply primitive, organic and ancient about their construction. They are steeped in the very soul of the land. They defied the revolutions of improvement that swept the land, retaining their character far longer than other industries. Arriving in Britain about 4000 CE, the Neolithic, the first farmers, practiced transhumance. They still do in some parts of Europe. Early farmers and their cattle, once in the glens in Scotland, bringing with them the knowledge of transhumance, they knew they needed upland pastures to graze the animals in the spring. Now, we don't really know what conditions of the uplands were exactly, but in the worst case scenario, he may have first driven cattle up to an area of little grazing quality and then be forced to carry fodder up to the cattle while they were there. But over time, decades even, the trail to the new pasture was fertilised with lush and verdant grass, would begin to grow along the route. The new pasture would become better and better grazing land over time, to a point where the farmer no longer needed to carry fodder for the cattle. The farmer has created a self-sustaining ecosystem where he no longer needs to farm grass anymore. This is a very unique property to cattle. Not all grazing animals are like this. Goats and pigs aren't. Perhaps the cows themselves deserve the praise too. I'm not sure if they wouldn't have done this by themselves, albeit more slowly. In a village once where I stayed, as part of a lottery, a field was divided up into 100 numbered 1 metre squares. They then sold the numbers tickets. Once ready, they let one cow into the field, and wherever, more or less, in which square he first took a crap, wins the lottery. Cool, huh? So, how does this system of transhumance, where roads are created from the lower glens up to the Shielings, how does this evolve and become drove roads. They will join up, and this is what I mean by joining up. Um, this is a typical day's droving. 1 to 2 hours grazing in the morning, a 3 to 4 hour walk, uh, 2 hours grazing in the afternoon, then another trek to the evening pastures. There are exceptions. Sometimes the terrain would need cattle to cover greater distance than the average 11-12 miles. Cold and wet, lacking any decent grazing, they might need to walk further. The drovers paced their herds so that they arrived at the markets in good form. This is a universal requirement of any road to drive cattle. And here we can see a section of Drove Road. It's a big rough green line. It runs between Glenlivet at the top, which says Ladderfoot, and Invernochty, Strathdawn at the bottom. The cattle would graze for an hour in the braes of Glenlivet before taking a steep road out from Glenlivet at Ladder for about 5-6 miles before arriving at Duff Defiance. You can see that in the middle of this screen. A strategic location, for these are the sheilings in the grazing ground where the cattle would need 2 hours grazing. From here, they would descend to Invernochty at Strathdawn before fording the River Don, which is marked in yellow at the bottom. So we can see. So that's the basic pattern of a drove road. A patch of pasture, a thin road of green track, followed by another patch of grazing, another thin road of green track, followed by another patch of grazing. Over a 12 miles distance and an 8 hour drove, the pattern repeats. It's the bare minimum that cattle and drove roads need over any distance wherever you are. Even if you're in London, if you're on the York Way 12 miles from Smithfield Market, or on the Holloway cattle dock going to the Caledonia Market, somewhere en route, as close to halfway as possible, you will need to stop and let the cattle graze for a few hours. So let's go and have a look at Glenlivet at the top. This is the braes of Glenlivet, and we can see it's a lush oasis of green grass. The farms Lochaveich, Scallan, Dimmick Moor, and Thane. Remember, Thane, it's in the top right. Now we come to Naharich, now called Ladderfoot. We've just gone past it. The green line, by the way, is the route of the road, and the blue line is a small stream. The white lines are larger streams. This place is called Laterach in Gaelic. It's from Leiter, Lieter, and as far as I'm aware, it means the same thing, ladder. Which, looking at how steep it is, that is a pretty good description of this hill. But there's something else that's a little bit unusual about this particular drove road. There's not a blade of grass anywhere. It doesn't look like a road that's been used for 6,000 years for transhumance. So, I mean, it may have looked completely different in the past. In the far past, we can't be sure of that. But certainly, in the last sort of 1,000, 2,000 years, it looks like the people in Glen Shiel have been, taking their cattle up to different sheilings in different parts of Glenlivet, and certainly not up here. We can also see the Moine Iceach steading just there next to Duff Defiance. For information, a shebeen is a place where illicit alcohol is sold. You find them often in Scotland and in Ireland. At the bottom there next to Duff Defiance, you can actually see the outline of the old shebeen as it was. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because there's a website called Dobaran Duchleis, meaning the well of riches or the kist of riches. And it's got a collection of recordings that were made by Hamish Henderson back in 1955. This was just at the start of sort of media, and he had his newfound video recorder or tape recorder, probably the size of a small fridge, and he went round to all of these places and he spoke with these old people, and he spoke with a guy called Taylor, who was the great grandson of an the lassie that used to actually run this shebeen, Eppie Lucky Thane. If you remember the name of the farm over in Glenlivet, it's probably where she hails from. Um, but he was already in his 90s when he was interviewed by Hamish Henderson in 1955. And his grandmother died in 18. His great grandmother died in 1881 when she was 99 years old. So it's a conversation on tape with somebody who had frequent conversations with his great grandmother, who was born in 1781, which is quite remarkable as well. Um, Also, the name Duff Defiance is supposedly named after a man who was evicted from Glenlivet for illicit distilling. Uh, he crossed the ladder to Donside and established a new distilling site in Glenorchy, which is where you are here. He also gained squatters' rights by having a house built with its lum reeking, i.e., its chimney smoking, before being challenged by the local laird, hence Duff Defiance. And you can see at the top of this image Moyn Yesiech, which is where the still was located. It's less than half a mile from the shebeen Duff Defiance. Also, Eppie Thane at Duff Defiance, when she was running the shebeen, she also sold food as well. So the road was busy enough that, to support somebody actually feeding people as they crossed over from Glenlivet to Donside. Certainly, the drovers themselves, they would have to wait for a couple of hours in Duff Defiance while the cattle grazed. So why not have a drink? As they say in these parts, if you burn the candle at both ends, you'll no last the wick. So moving on from Duff Defiance, we can see the road. It crosses natural fords down to Aldechui, or Lost. Not sure why it's called Lost. But you can see straight away that there is an awful lot more grass here at the sides of these roads. This looks like a road that's had several thousand years of people practicing transhumance, going, coming up from Strathdawn in Vernorchy, up here past Invernetty, Led Mackay and Ochernach. But the drover is going to have to stop and overnight at one of these areas, or he can cross the ford at Bellabeg. The yellow line there is the River Don, and seek pasture on the other side of the River Don. But most likely, if you look at next to the word Candacraig, you can see Invernorchy. That's the actual market stance for this area, and it's most likely that he would have overnighted his cattle up there. So looking north from um, Strathdawn up towards Duff Defiance and then down to Ladderfoot, I think what we can say is that the road from Strathdawn up to Duff Defiance has been created by the process of transhumance. But I do not think that the people in Glenlivet were using the road up to Duff Defiance for spring and summer pasturing at the Sheelings of Duff Defiance. Perhaps they have other places in Glenlivet that were more suitable or better or closer. But that's neither here nor there. The second that Duff Defiance, the pasture there is good enough to support cattle grazing there, then immediately the road from Ladderfoot to Duff Defiance then becomes open. So effectively, the drove road from Ladderfoot to Strathdawn is created by having the shealing at Duff Defiance. And I think this is how drove roads evolved. Once again, I would hasten to add that we don't know what it was like back in the Neolithic times, what the land was like. I wonder if science might in the future be able to tell us more about that. It may well have been that they were people from Glenlivet at that time using this area as Sheelings, but that it was abandoned and it's disappeared under the peat and the moss and the heather that we see on the heights today. Now you're actually familiar with this stretch of drove roads, I'd like to point out that on my map I use green lines to indicate drove roads, but I also use green lines to indicate Kirk roads and coffin roads. Often they're one and the same, or they're used for the same purpose, but not always. But for your information, a Kirk road is a road that people would walk on a Sunday to go to church, and it could be as much as 5 to 10 miles long. And then back the same distance after the service had finished. The coffin road as well is used in a similar function. But we're lucky enough to have a recording once again by Hamish Henderson of a chap called Sandy Simpson, this is taken in 1955, so apologies for the quality once again. But he's describing the funeral of Donald Grant, who died in Strathdown. This is in 1881, and he was born in Glenlivet, so he was taken from Strathdown to Glenlivet. So let's listen to hear what Sandy Simpson has to say about this. As I said, apologies for the poor quality of the audio there, but I did at least put a transcription in there which may have helped you. Other points about coffin roads is that often there would be places along the length of the road where they would stop and lay down the coffin and have a dram. But if there was no obvious place, no flat rock that they could lay the coffin down on, they would then literally set up a stone along the road for a specific use of laying down the coffin so they could have a dram. If you looked in the first fly-through that I did, you could see there's one right on the very top of the ladder. And obviously you will often find them outside the front of the actual kirks, where when they arrived at the kirk they could lay down the coffin on this stone and have a dram. While they went through the formalities of entering into the graveyard. So, listening to Sandy's description about what happened is they basically got up to Duff Defiance and laid down the coffin and then spent the day with these Glenlivet Shields, drinking and fighting and fighting and drinking. Bear in mind, just a point, the Shebeen at Duff Defiance, it didn't sell nips. It didn't sell the shots that you get in the States or like we have in Britain now. They're usually 35 millilitres or a fifth of a gill. They sold whiskey in half gills and full gills. Basically, a gill is a quarter of a pint. That's a large amount of whiskey. So I think at the end of the day, the Lunsford, Invernacht and Strathdon got the better deal because at least they could then just roll down the hill and go home, whereas these tunes from Glenlivet, right, after the entire day, they would then have to carry the coffin all the way back down to Glenlivet. Now, if there's 20 guys in teams of 4, there's a chance you're going to have to carry that coffin for over a mile. And you've seen the terrain, what it's like. And on top of that, every man has had at least a bottle of whiskey each to drink. Something tells me that sometimes these processions on these coffin roads were less than dignified. It's around such cattle created pasture that the earliest settlements grew up. Cattle droves were always welcome to graze free of charge at all common grazing areas, market stances, local farmers' fields, pretty much everywhere. Why wouldn't locals welcome 1,000 head of cattle to graze on their town's common ground for a week? Aye, the cattle will eat their grass, but the grass will grow back and it will recover much better for having a week's worth of cow manure from 1,000 cows dumped on it. A win-win for the locals. It would be interesting to know what the locals thought of these cattle. Perhaps they considered them like herds of cute My Little Ponies farting rainbows wherever they go. It's no surprise that cattle are worshipped in many places around the world. But I think I'll end the video on this point here. The next part will be looking at dating of these drove roads. How old are they? And hopefully if you like this video you'll subscribe and hit the like button, and I'll see you in the next video.